Well, to answer your second question first, it certainly didn't. My project does not hinge on getting rid of Trump, in part because actually all the other plausible alternatives for the kind of 2024 Republican nomination are much more likely to be, were in fact, conventionally Republican, that is hostile or indifferent at best to organized labor. Um, there were a couple like Vivek Ramaswamy or Governor Ron DeSantis who made these kind of populist noises, but if you drill down on what their policy platform is, it's basically kind of neoliberal. Um, and you know, in the case of DeSantis, I think Trump actually, or Trump aligned PACs, political action committees, pretty devastatingly showed how he was, um, you know, he had been a Social Security quote unquote reformer, meaning wanting to slash benefits or raise the retirement age or even privatize them back when he had been in a member of Congress. So yeah, my project, insofar as it's a project of the right, has been focused on trying to provide what I call the Eisenhower-Nixon tradition in the Republican Party, which was more at peace with the New Deal order. And I think that that's what Trump represented in 2016. That's why he won the largest marginal share of union households for any Republican president in like more than a generation. It's why he talked about free trade. It's why he made these kind of inroads or attempts to recruit rank and file union members and households. That going back to 2016, we can discuss how effective he was at delivering on that agenda when he was actually in office. I think there are some things that we can give him credit for. You know, the tariffs on China, which at the time were greeted with such horror on the part of the establishment, but now talk of tariffs, talk of deglobalization, talk of decoupling, de-risking, these have all become kind of conventional establishment opinions. Like Financial Times columnists now call for this stuff. So all of this is to say that, like, of all the options out there, Trump was probably still the closest to the what I call the Nixon Eisenhower tradition, more kind of solidaristic, you know, skeptical of free trade for its own sake, and so on. And then now to go back to your first question, like how is that all going overall? The effort, I'm not even sure the goal is to win labor for the Republican Party. As I've said repeatedly, I think the kinds of reforms we're seeing, where we want to see closer manufacturing or onshoring or close shoring or friend shoring manufacturing, closer supply chains so they're not so far flung and dependent on adversary nations. This is really a bipartisan consensus now. And that's, as I said, I think when I spoke at this ablation event with Chris Cutrone, I feel like I'm pushing on a half open door, meaning notwithstanding the ferocious disagreements between like Trump and Biden or the Democratic and Republican parties at the level of campaigning, this kind of thinking has become sort of the new conventional opinion of the establishment, which is good. I mean, we want the establishment to think a certain way as opposed to another way. And it's been forced by geopolitical realities, political domestic reality, and so on. But still, as I said then, and still say, look, insofar as we're talking about specifically pro-labor reforms, most of those will continue, I think, to come from the left and center left. What you want is enough individual right of center leaders who are willing to sign on for that, for their own either kind of national security or idealistic or political opportunity reasons, or a mix of those. And so far as that goes, there continues to be progress. Just over the weekend, the official account of the Teamsters Union put out a tweet saying that they've donated an additional $5,000 to the campaign of Senator Josh Hawley of Missouri. I mean, that's not a lot of money, but for a union, first of all, it is. And as you know, but I think unions are maxed out for direct contributions the same way individuals and corporations are. They can give more to a political action committee. And that was on top of other previous announcements by the Teamsters saying that they would give more and more to Hawley. Again, in terms of J.D. Vance, I think he, at the time I mentioned, and still ongoing, he has this proposal where he's teamed up with Liz Warren to claw back the executive compensation of banks that have been bailed out by the taxpayer. The idea being that taxpayers shouldn't foot the huge salaries of banks who have been needed to be bailed out. He's still pushing his, Vance is still pushing his train, kind of a rail reform bill, basically trying to limit the kind of just-in-time, very thin labor scheduling that caused that exacerbated the accident, the disaster in East Palestine, Ohio, and these other kinds of examples that I can point to. So that project is continuing to come along. Still, I mean, I think as I've described it then, I would still describe it as green shoots. The Republican Party as a whole, even though it has this working class base increasingly, and there is a real realignment, still remains in many ways the party of like small and regional capital. I think is something I said then too. It's like it's not even the party of big business in some ways. It's the party of the guy who owns a chain of tire distribution centers in a particular area in West Virginia or in the Research Triangle of North Carolina. That's the kind of power base of the Republican Party, the guys who go to like the rubber chicken dinners and toast the self-made man. And that has to be actually a very kind of a class that is typically most hostile, I would argue, to pro-labor reforms. But you have individual lawmakers, like I said, doing these kinds of things. If you agree that kind of importing large numbers of unskilled labor affects wages and it's a way to undercut the wages of working class people, the non-college majority in this country, then I would argue that the broad Republican stance, the Trumpian stance of trying to shut down the border, which has also now become like a source of frustration for even people here in New York City, like the flood of migrants taking over schools and taking over public services, putting strain on public services. That also is another element of this kind of new turn in American political economy that's reflected on the right as well. So overall, basically, I'm trying to say a mixed picture. But I think between the left and right, and this is, as you know, this is the kind of politics I've been trying to champion, there is a kind of new center, new consensus emerging that is post-neoliberal. What you're saying, Doug, is basically that if we're going to have a restoration of that period of class compression that characterized the mid-century kind of peak social democratic New Deal era, that will come at the expense of geopolitical tension and potentially full-on great power conflict. And I think that's a serious concern and one that I share, and to which I don't have neat answers. In other words, I think it will be up to the kind of prudent, pragmatic leadership of people in Washington and our allies across Europe, who are basically dancing to our tune right now anyway. Like the U.S. has so reasserted itself over Europe over the past 2 years, to think about how to do what we call decoupling, especially from China, on what the Europeans call de-risking, but it's basically the same thing, without needlessly stoking war. And I think there is a way to do that. And what, for example, it looks like is, on the geopolitical plane, the United States has certain allies to which it's treaty bound to defend, and that's part of the world order that we made after World War II, and I think should continue to maintain those. But in other areas where we don't have treaty commitments, it wouldn't be bad, and I've called for this, to not insist that every inch of the planet is effectively the United States sphere of influence, so that if any other regional great power asserts itself a little bit in its own neighborhood, that we then treat that as an encroachment on our sphere of influence and a potential sort of casus belli. So what that means is, for example, thinking very hard about, are we really committed to defending Taiwan at the great cost? If you can imagine what it would mean in terms of how much easier it would be for China to take over Taiwan, whereas us defending Taiwan from several thousand miles away. I mean, I know we have bases and so on, but it's much more difficult. And then being realistic, and saying, look, the semiconductors that Taiwan develops don't grow on a special semiconductor tree that is only, indigenous to Taiwanese soil. You can, as the Biden administration is actually trying to do, although I would argue they're not even doing enough, you can, do manufacturing of chips here. It takes investment, and it actually could create lots of great union jobs. It can create high-wage manufacturing jobs. So like, there is a path that looks like decoupling, but not war. But it requires, a kind of prudent leadership of the kind that we had, again, during the post-war era, where despite the fact that the United States rhetorically often saber-rattled or talked about freedom versus democracy versus Soviet tyranny, et cetera, in fact, those leaders were quite pragmatic. They insist on having open lines of communication so that you don't have catastrophic misunderstandings, et cetera. So to like combine the kind of blocking, and I mean BLOC, not BLOCK, just creating block formations where, this is our sphere, this is yours, and we trade within our own respective spheres. And we negotiate over certain areas where we think are, there are sort of disputed zones, but we don't insist on every single one of these disputed zones being within the kind of American sphere. But no, I fully recognize, though, that that's easier said than done. And, if the Chinese feel kind of frustrated in their development because of these kinds of steps, then it could heighten the risk of conflict. And so it's a matter of kind of prudent contingent choices, which, like, if you're committed to a completely deterministic Marxist account of how kind of large structures work, you discount that, right? And you say, like, it's inevitable that conflict will arise. But I'm not. I think that much in human affairs turns on chance, contingent choices, better or worse choices, and so on. And therefore, to go in a certain political economic direction needed mean war. But I realize the danger. I tend to buy the John Mearsheimer theory of why the Ukraine war happened. This after the Cold War was over, to insist on ever greater NATO expansion. I mean, I think it used to be called something like strategic empathy. But like, if you are in Russia's shoes, if you're in the Kremlin, you do watch with alarm. Okay, you might grumblingly begrudgingly accept, Hungary and other Central and Eastern European states being incorporated into the NATO sphere, and therefore kind of the NATO border coming closer and closer to your own. But like, Ukraine is obviously much more disturbing to you. And I think the Russians have been so clear about why they say the nonsense about like denazifying Ukraine and stuff too, but as far as setting that kind of claptrap aside, like, they have a point, I think. And this kind of Victoria Nuland project of, essentially claiming every inch of Europe for the kind of NATO, EU, US-led bloc was a mistake. And I think that the Biden administration jumped on this escalatory ladder on the theory that that in Ukraine you can bleed Russia dry without committing starting a direct Great War confrontation between two nuclear armed blocs. So far, it's kind of worked in the sense that we haven't had a direct NATO-Russia confrontation, but it's come at great cost for the Ukrainians, like hundreds of thousands. That, of course, they won't release the numbers, the figures of fatalities and troops removed from the battlefield. And for what? Like, the counteroffensive was a flop. They're spending enormous number of but money and human lives on taking 1 or 2 inches. So yeah, I mean, I think that's been a mistake, especially because I tend to subscribe to the view, and this is why I'm not a paleocon and a total isolationist. Paleocons tend to be isolationists, like I am not. I mean, I think the world is always going to be divided into these competing blocks, and I root for one of the blocks and not the others. But the interesting things are in the for the 21st century are in the Pacific region, and not in Europe per se. Certainly not in Ukraine. So it's a waste to get on that escalatory ladder, especially given the risk of like Putin might have felt really humiliated at one point had things turned out differently, and he might have dropped a tactical nuclear weapon, and then we would be in a different world, a really terrifying world. The Middle East is, I think, the Biden administration has threaded a difficult needle of trying to, look, after October 7th, the United States and of the West are committed to, Israel's safety. The idea of a Jewish homeland and that event so pierced the sense of Jewish safety that it I think that it's a kind of cliche to say Israel has a right to defend itself, but I also think it's true. But at the same time, the U.S. doesn't want this to become a regional war. And I think it's a column I'm writing right now that the Biden administration's position is like a very difficult position to try to maintain, because the pro-Israel hawks will say that he's not doing enough. And of course, progressives are increasingly fed up. But so far, even as we speak, and now it's Monday morning, and there was talk of a regional war breaking out over the weekend, but it didn't, because the Biden administration basically, as we know, told the Iranians that we will not get involved, do a choreographed thing, do your thing so you can save face, because the Israelis did a pretty outrageous thing, like hitting a diplomatic facility. So lob your missiles, but do it in a choreographed way, and most of them were shot down. I think it was 320 objects, drones, ballistic missiles, and cruise missiles, and 99% were intercepted. And the Iranians said, the matter is closed. If you don't further escalate. So now it's up to the Israelis to chill out, to play ball with that, and we'll see. And I think so. The one thing, where I think the Biden administration has disappointed me over the course of the past 7 months since the October 7th thing is, the expression of frustration over certain things that should have been louder, like the humanitarian trucks should not be held up or turned back, as people are genuinely hungry. And as now Samantha Power, director of USAID, has basically said there is impending famine. I think we could have used tougher rhetoric on that. The fact that the Israeli officials are now openly saying there will never be a Palestinian state puts a lot of people like me who are sympathetic to the idea of the need for a Jewish state. That's a kind of bedrock belief for me, but it puts us in a kind of very unenviable position, because that was always premised on Palestinian national aspirations being fulfilled at some point in this kind of two states living side by side. When people in Bibi's cabinet say such things like there will never be a Palestinian state, or some of the rhetoric they use, I think maybe the Biden administration in retrospect could have been at least rhetorically tougher a little bit on that kind of behavior. And then, of course, they've done the sort of, now you have this kind of petty, humiliating settler attacks on Palestinians in the West Bank. I think even for Israel's own sake of not becoming a pariah state out of this, um, you know, it might have behooved Biden to just be a little bit tougher. But again, I think it's a really unenviable position. If you're the United States, something like October 7th happened, you're committed to that Israelis have a right to defend themselves, and the idea of a Hamas that's capable of doing this kind of thing is unacceptable. On the other hand, you don't want a regional war. It's a hellish situation. As naive as it is, I think that or as naive as it may sound, I think there's something to the small d democratic traditions, which haven't taken root elsewhere in the same way. That, I mean, for all the ways in which we can agree that, ballot box choices are structured by kind of elite forces, and that like not everything that might be popular among voters makes it to legislation, or viewpoints that would be otherwise popular are sort of kept out of the legitimate opinion corridor. I accept all of that, but still there's a degree to which ordinary people can countervail elite power through the ballot box that I think is precious. And so I don't have this thing of like romanticizing Xi Jinping's regime or Putin's regime as like the sort of subaltern voice of the oppressed global South. Like, give me a fucking break. I mean, in terms of the comparisons with regimes like China's or Russia's, I will say, like, as recently as 3 years ago, I would have been like outrageous. There's no parallel to be drawn. I think we did see some things that were really disturbing. And of course, yes, it doesn't look like it often does in China, where you are disappeared, if you're a person who disagrees. But it's from a certain angle. I mean, this will sound controversial. It's even more insidious, where some Silicon Valley oligarch can make your voice disappear in the public square without you're still there, but you've been sort of unpersoned, and it's all according to the terms of service that you, as someone who has so little bargaining power, have supposedly voluntarily consented to when you signed up for the social media platform. Mm-hmm. Yes, I think that the past 2-3 years, especially 4 years, or maybe you could say since the rise of this current wave of populism in the mid-2010s, there has been a kind of opening of our eyes, at least mine. One is the sense that our elite really became kind of self-conscious as an elite. At some point, like someone like Bill Kristol realized that he shares more with Hillary Clinton than he ever would with the Trumpian backcountry, and that kind of one can be a member of the elite and still not be self-consciously so. In a sort of we might have our disagreements, but we are the elite, and like this ferment, in the backcountry threatens us. Yeah, I mean, this stuff is very disturbing. I still think, we do have this interesting inheritance. For me, it's not so much like the founding; it's because I think it's very hard to reduce the American idea with it to a capital I idea, or a capital C creed. But it's like 200 some years of democratic practice, which, to my mind, reading it through a Catholic lens, is an approximation of the kind of idea of the common good, which is the kind of classical and Christian basis of why we formed political communities in the first place. In the American context, that plays itself through, it unfolds through the Jacksonians, through the progressive farmers, through the populists, through the New Dealers, and so on. In this
Eugene Debs.
Yes, of course, in the socialist, and all these kind of counter traditions. And you look at that, and so you look at, for example, the Jacksonians, and you might read You might read a quote from a conservative of the early 19th century, a kind of federalist, old-fashioned federalist conservative like Noah Webster, who's like, liberty has died in this land. And what he means is like, there's just been an expansion of popular democracy. And it's not much different than some of the anxiety of like MSNBC, Rachel Maddow liberals about the backcountry getting essentially too much of a say. But in that dynamic kind of opposition between those two forces, somehow the small d democratic tradition and the kind of quest for the common good has persisted, and I cherish it. I have to root for it. I mean, I worry about the lawfare that's been unleashed against Trump, especially. The kind of barrage of charges, and like any one of them, you might think there's some merit to them, right? So like the withholding of like classified documents and putting him in his like own safe in Mar-a-Lago, or whatever. But like it seems like every ex-official has like a cache of classified documents in his bathtub, or in his garage, but only Trump gets charged, or like the charges in New York are kind of, I think, do really strike me as dubious. The effort now defeated to kick him off the ballot. I think this stuff is very, very dangerous. I just think like I'm with Sam Moyn, the Yale scholar. He's written for Compact on lawfare, and he's just like to the left. Like I'm telling you, just put forward a broad populist, popular agenda instead of trying to carry on this kind of lawfare, because you do enough of it, and you might have a constitutional strife. I don't want to talk about civil war, but you might have serious breakdown in the faith of ordinary people. Like you think about like conservative military families, etc., in the constitutional order that their children primarily still uphold when shit comes to shit. And like, if they lose faith, scary, terrible things could happen that aren't a straight up civil war. I don't think the 2020 election was stolen. I think it's a legitimate election largely, but the idea that it was quasi-rigged is kind of plausible to me. Like, all the changes in time, manner, place of voting that were done by courts, that's the Constitution says those are up to state legislatures. Like in Pennsylvania, they did it by judicial fiat. Like all the changes that came down, like I just think like it should be possible to like hold an election in one day, make it a national holiday. Everyone's off work. It's open from 6 a.m. to like midnight, so that anyone can go at any time, and like it's all counted in a day. And like lots of developed democracies manage this somehow, like France, doesn't have any mail-in voting because in the 1970s they decided it's too prone to irregularities. Like, why can't the most advanced economy in the world just have like elections that end in a day and like the results are clear? Our overall goal is to renew the social democratic and Christian democratic tradition, kind of an order that's marked by shared prosperity, higher wages, social stability. We think social stability goes hand in hand with that kind of political economic vision. And we want a left that is less prone to what Zara Wagenknecht calls, lifestyle leftism, this kind of only policing ordinary people at the level of consumption. I wrote a piece calling it pseudo progressivism. What I mean by that is like, a progressivism that isn't seemingly concerned with like how we produce things, like relations of production, and trying to alter them or reform them so that the overall distribution of the social income is more balanced. But rather, it's only about sort of making life a little bit shittier every day. So, in New York City, like every lane now increasingly, if you try to drive, is like there's like 2 bike lanes and 2 bus lanes, so that there's only one lane you can drive down, and it's like clogged. It's trying to, it is kind of sadistic in a sense that it's trying to get people not to drive. Okay, fine. But then you go to the underground and it's, increasingly there's disorder. There's like, both at the level of, crazy people who can push you in front of oncoming trains, or a kind of visible social breakdown that like you don't want your kids to be exposed to, like, people shooting drugs and so on. So then it's like, okay, well, I'll try to walk. And then you walk and it's like, then you have like, the pedestrian zones are like utterly overrun by migrants, Honduran migrants trying to like race to deliver. They're utterly hyper exploited. So like they're in the DoorDash economy and they could care less like when pedestrians are walking, So you finally make it through all of this and you get like your coffee drink and it's a paper straw and it melts in your mouth like cardboard. This is not progressivism. It doesn't have a sense of abundance of life,
Right.
On the right, we want less kind of typically neoliberal, the kind of conservatism that's like, oh, family formation rates are declining. Oh, people are atomized. Oh, this is all bad. But in terms of political economy, it's either indifferent or explicitly behind the kind of economic forces that bring about these kinds of social outcomes.
Right.
So our goal is to like critique both elements on the right and left that have contributed to this, and try to elevate, voices of various different stripes. There's like, we publish yourself and people associated with like the sublation sphere and platypus. We publish on the other side like, Jacobin types like Ben Burgess. We publish populists like Josh Hawley and Marco Rubio, trying to sort of, and it can sometimes look like a magazine that if you read it, by the end you're done, you're cross-eyed because of the way that it's like, woo, from the left, from the very hard Marxist, left, and then from the right, but there is a method to the madness, certain tendencies that we try to bring to the fore and others that we try to critique.
If you enjoyed this conversation, please do consider supporting us on Patreon. Our patrons help to make sure that Sublation Media can continue to provide interviews, videos, books, and articles that are critical of the left from the left. If you are tired of remaining stuck within bourgeois ideologies and politics, help us sublate them both.